Hello and welcome to this episode of Star Wars Generations podcast. Today is one of our special members only episodes where we'll be talking about our next book in the book club, The Light of the Jedi. And we're doing that with frequent guest and Star Wars expert extraordinaire, Danielle of Written in the Star Wars. Danielle, how are we doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on here again.
And I think of you primarily as a TikToker, but at this point you are writing articles on websites, you're all over Twitter. For those who haven't gotten to hear you before, just want to learn more about all that is Danielle and all the things you talk about, give us a little rundown of that.
Yeah, well, I talk about Star Wars mostly, but when The Last of Us is airing, I talk about that. Sometimes dabble in MCU, not really all that often anymore, but yeah, also books, just any type of books that I'm reading or get reviews of. I talk about that on Twitter, on TikTok, I write articles for Temple of Geek. Right now, they're weekly review articles for The Bad Batch, and I'm hoping to do the same for The Acolyte when it comes out.
Nice. Yeah, I've been following those articles. They're really great insights there. I will also say, Danielle has been on both of my podcasts. We had her on to talk about the Hunger Games and some of the more recent books and movies. And I would also say that for anybody who isn't sure and wants to kind of double check with themselves, when did a recent Taylor Swift album come out? Check her feed, because every time within like 24 hours of the album dropping, you're giving some great analysis that I always really appreciate and love.
Thank you. I spent way too much time. I woke up at 5 a.m. for the latest album because that's when it dropped over in the UK, and to make my Star Wars characters as the Tortured Poets Department songs.
I appreciated that. Well, and I am appreciating everyone's content about Taylor, but you give me a lot more how these songs relate to you versus which is about Matt and which is about Joe. So I do appreciate that difference in perspective. But today we do have you on to talk about Star Wars, specifically The Light of the Jedi. And let me just give a quick intro to this book. If anyone's watching on video, she just held up a copy. We'll put a picture in the show notes. The Light of the Jedi is the first book of the High Republic series, which is something that started a couple of years ago now, and that has become a very big part of Star Wars publishing. There are a number of adult novels. I mean, not adult, but what do you call a novel that's not YA or kids? Just
a novel.
Yeah,
but I do call them adult novels when I'm talking about the High Republic, just because it gets the point across. But it does sound
for sure. And while there's nothing that's going to make the book talk girlies and boys go crazy, there's a little bit more adult content than you've had in any other Star Wars thing to begin with, to be sure, which we'll talk about. But it's this collection of books and YA novels and children's books and graphic novels and all sorts of things like that. And most importantly, we've learned that the Acolyte series, which is going to be coming out in June, which Danielle just mentioned, is taking place at the end of the High Republic series of books and during that time period, and will include some major characters from the book. So I thought this was a great time to start that conversation. This is the book club, obviously, specifically. We're going to do a lot more about it, though, also in our regular episodes, do kind of just summaries of the different phases, really to help get you ready for not only just enjoying these great books, but enjoying the Acolyte itself. And we're going to have a lot more on that right after this. We're starting the conversation, but we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts, questions, or anything else you want to hear us discuss to feedback@theethicalpanda.com, or find us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok under Star Wars Generations. You can even chat with us on Discord or Facebook. Find those links in the show notes or on our website, theethicalpanda.com. And if you like this content, why not become a member? You get early access to ad-free episodes for all Ethical Panda podcasts, along with bonus content at the end of most episodes and members-only episodes. It's just $5 a month or $55 for a full year. Sign up at theethicalpanda.com or through the link in the show notes. And now, back to our episode. All right, thanks everyone. Welcome back. And there's a lot of great places out there where you're going to find book reviews of this book and full plot breakdowns and things like that. We're not necessarily going to do that. Instead, I want to talk about what this book teaches us, how it helps us better understand the Star Wars universe, both in terms of what we learn about the Jedi, what we learn about the Republic, this group, the Nihil, and of course, some of the specific characters. And so let me start with, but that being said, I do want to give a quick plot summary. And Danielle, please correct me on any details. We're starting about 250 years before the events of the prequel movies. So most of the characters we know haven't even been born yet. Yoda is around, but he's on a sabbatical right now. He's probably off in Cancun, studying something on the beach, having Mai Tai. What is Yoda's drink? Let us know in the comments. But the point is that the Jedi are kind of at their height, and we really get a picture of what the Jedi do in the world, that they're stopping, crime, that they're helping to make peace, that they're dealing with things, and there's this terrible tragedy that has occurred. There's been a crash in hyperspace. This isn't supposed to happen, but things are flying out of hyperspace, and they're coming out at near light speed, and something that going that fast, hitting a planet or a moon or a space station, is just going to flat out destroy it. And so the first third of the book is just dealing with that, and we get to see the Jedi coming together in amazing ways to stop all this, and there is a lot of damage, but they prevent it from getting far, far worse. And then as we learn that these emergencies are going to continue to happen, the kind of plot unwind, the kind of plot continues as the attempt to solve this mystery and figure out why it's happening and how do we stop it. Meanwhile, along the way, we're learning about this group called the Nihil. It's never explicitly said, but I think the connection of that word to nihilism and kind of nothingness is very intentional. They're very much like, we are pure freedom. We get to do whatever we want, including stealing from others. And the thing that makes them so powerful is that they have the ability to go through hyperspace in ways that nobody else can. We kind of get a lot into the metaphysics of hyperspace in this in interesting ways. We'll talk more about that. But they understand hyperspace in a way no one else does. No one really understands why, though. And over the course of the book, our heroes figure out that the Nihil were behind this. There's an attempt to kind of track them down and deal with them. And one group of the Nihil is completely destroyed. And we learn along the way that Marchion Ro, who until now had been kind of a quiet, mild-mannered guy who gives all the people in the Nihil the paths, the way to go through the hyperspace and all that he actually has always had this secret plan, that he's much more nefarious, that he's much more malevolent than anyone gave him credit for, that he's intentionally killed off a large part of his own group, A, to show that everyone that he's in control, and B, to let the Republic think that this Nihil threat is now dealt with and no one's going to worry about them anymore. He's also managed to capture a Jedi along the way, Loden Greatstorm, who we'll talk about in a bit. But our heroes do, for the most part, prevail through an awesome, if you've ever been that geek who just geeks out in the most geeky ways, you have a hero for you. A guy manages to string 54,000 nav droids together to do the biggest experiment anyone's ever done to figure out the emergencies. It's awesome. The Jedi stop most of them. The Jedi deal with the Nihil. And at the end of it, the Chancellor of the High Chancellor of the Galaxy, the same role that Palpatine will later hold, she is able to announce that Starlight Beacon is open. Starlight Beacon being this thing that has been a big part of her efforts to reach out to the Outer Rim, to make them more part of the Republic, and to help everyone in the Republic feel like they're all together, with her slogan being, "We are all the Republic." And that's kind of where the book ends. Any big things that I missed?
I don't think so. I think you covered it. There's not a ton, there's a lot that happens in this book, when you get into the bigger points, but as far as big points go, there's only really the two, like you said, the emergences and the discovery of the Nihil, really. In a lot of ways, this felt a lot to me like the first episode of a TV show, where a serialized TV show where the first episode is to show you all the characters, let you see kind of what their day-to-day is like, what are the tensions, who likes who doesn't like who, and then begin to introduce the problem that's going to become the kind of basis for the rest of the show. Mm-hmm. I agree. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen The Expanse.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds me of the first season of The Expanse, because
I think it's a good way of putting it.
Trying to figure out what's going on and who's who and what this world is. And I think that this first book is kind of a lot like that first season. Yeah.
So let's start with the Jedi, because until now, and with the extension of the extended universe, which does do some great things, but has now been, is not part of the official Disney canon, we have seen the Jedi during the prequel era, when we now kind of understand, they're still all powerful and all of the things, but the corruption is starting, the fall is starting. we haven't seen them, at just doing their thing. And of course, we saw, the rebuilding of the Jedi and all that. This is the Jedi in the High Republic before the fall has started, when they're kind of at their height. What do you learn about the Jedi here? And sort of how do these Jedi seem different from what we know of the Jedi in other times?
Well, they're not as tied to the Republic as they are in the prequels. I mean, they very much are tied to the Republic, but they're questioning it, I think, in ways that we don't really see the prequel Jedi do. The prequel Jedi are kind of like, why are we allowing them to tell us these things? But it's what we've done, so we kind of have to. In the High Republic is kind of, they've not been tied to the Republic this tightly for a long time yet. And so more of them are questioning it. They're less, they're not required as much to do the Republic and the Senate's bidding. Right. And so there's more room for kind of exploration, I think, amongst the Jedi as a group and as individuals. Like, I mean, you have way seekers who go off into the galaxy, searching to connect themselves more strongly to the Force, going wherever they feel the Force is guiding them. They're not tied to the Council or to the Order, really. They're still a part of the Order, but they kind of get to do their own thing. And in my opinion, that is what Ahsoka would have ended up being if they still had like way seekers in like an ideal universe in Star Wars where nothing bad happened. But they're a little bit more lenient, and I think that was the point of the series is to show what they used to be and how they end up falling to where they are in the prequels.
Yeah, I think one thing we talk about sometimes when it comes to the prequels is this idea that they're more focused on the letter of the law than the spirit of the law. And this really feels like it's the opposite. I mean, again, there's nothing explicit. There will be some of that in later books, but we're basically told that there's kind of an idea of, kind of like kids are going to play doctor, like Padawans are going to explore things with each other and it's basically said like they're going to have physical relationships that they're supposed to put aside once they become Jedi Knights. And two of the characters that we meet are Elzar Mann and Avis Chris, who we're going to speak about a little more in specific, because just the smile on Danielle's face, I know these are favorite characters of hers. And of mine, I think of many people. It's made very clear that they have a very close relationship that had a physical element at one point. And we hear from Elzar Mann's perspective this idea that they're both holding on to it, that they're both kind of always thinking about, those times and could they happen again, with maybe the idea that, the kind of situationship where two people are having fun and then one grows beyond it and the other is like, no, we're still in love. Like that's the impression I got from these two. But yeah, so it's a very interesting kind of introduction to this idea of the understanding of what it means to avoid attachments is very, very different.
Yeah. I think with Elzar and Avar, they're so very similar, but like you said, they have different perspectives of what the Order's tenements mean, I think. And Elzar, or maybe not understandings, but I think Elzar is more willing to push those boundaries than Avar is. And I think it's made pretty clear in the book that Avar has a more like not a stronger connection to the Force than Elzar does, but she nurtures it more than Elzar does. And so I think it's important to her in the way that Elzar's relationships are important to him.
Right.
And that's an interesting storyline throughout the series.
Very much so. And in this book particularly, it's shown how they're both a little bit at odds, but also how they can be wonderful partners in terms of working with the Force, because, and this we hear much more from her perspective, she kind of is more powerful in the Force, but he's a lot more dynamic and inventive. And so there's this moment when all those droids are starting to overheat, and it might cause the whole experiment to fail and then not to be able to figure out where the emergencies are. And he has this idea to basically use the Force to coax Rain. And she at first, and their connection is strong enough that she's able to just kind of see him kneel and close his eyes and start affecting the Force, understand what he's doing, and she has a moment of like, this is why he's great. I never would have thought of that, but also he's never going to do it without me.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like he has the idea and then he needs to work with her, but their connection is strong enough that they can together affect the Force enough to change the weather on a planet, quite literally.
Yeah, I love the way the Force is explained in these books, especially in Light of the Jedi, because to me, it had been a while since I read Star Wars books before I read Light of the Jedi. And this was like what pulled me back in because it felt like a starting point, a really good like reintroduction to Star Wars and to the literary aspect of Star Wars as well. And the way that Charles Soule, the author, describes the Force is so beautiful. And this is carried on by all of the authors throughout the series, but I think especially in this book, is when we first learn that many of the Jedi experience the Force in different ways. And so for Avar, she hears the Force in music. It's like it's like a symphony or an orchestra that she essentially can conduct, and each Jedi adds their own like note to it. And for Elzar, he feels the Force as an ocean.
Right.
And that like kind of ties into like the water and everything. And so like everyone kind of adds to that. And each Jedi is different in how they experience it. And I thought that was such a clever way of explaining the Force to people. Because it can feel like this otherworldly thing and this abstract thing. But with this description makes it more tangible, and you can actually see it in your mind when they're using it.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful because to me it kind of does both, because I agree with you. Sometimes it can feel so abstract as to be impossible to wrap your hands around. Other times it can feel like, this person has 3 points of force power. This person has 4 points of force power. And the powers are choking, lightning, throwing you, like, it's a very kind of like almost game mechanics. And showing this, there's the old story of the blindfolded people and the elephant, and the idea, and this is often used in religious circles in ways that I really like. It's the idea that like each of them is only seeing a part of it, and the danger is if anyone is like, no, the elephant is a trunk, it's all like this, or this other person's like, the elephant is a tail, it's like this. When the reality is that they're all only seeing a part of this larger whole, and also that they're all seeing like it is something that is fundamentally beyond their ability to describe, and so they're creating their own metaphors, but because they're different, they're each creating a different metaphor. And like I've always loved that as an idea of religion or spirituality of any kind, is that like for me the metaphor of this particular faith tradition works, or for someone else it's the metaphor of science, and or just the what they've learned in Star Trek, or like whatever it is. And so so I thought that did such a good job of conveying this is something that is mystical and spirit, and to use the word spiritual, but kind of beyond their comprehension, but that they've each come up with a way to understand it and talk about it so they can relate to each other.
Yeah. And in their own terms, it gives them not an ownership of it, but I feel like an actual understanding of it, maybe, as opposed to maybe what we see with the prequel era Jedi, is that maybe they don't have that type of connection to the Force anymore because they don't really have like that understanding of it, or the time to build that understanding of it the way that they did in the High Republic era.
Yeah. Like I think somewhat of it's only really touched on in the prequels, but some of the books go into more about how Qui-Gon Jinn, who I think also would have probably become a way seeker under this idea, that he has an understanding of the living Force, and that is something different from the way that other people see it. And I haven't quite seen it directly, but I'm going to be curious to see if that's a term that's ever used in these books, or just that we get into that idea of like that he's kind of talking about what has become the new version of the discussion. But that there's there's always been out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's more of a how everything connects together rather than just the bigger picture, if that makes sense. Yeah, definitely. The individual components as opposed to the tools as opposed to the creation, maybe.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It also felt to me, and I might be reading things into this, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, but it felt to me that in the same way that they're not quite as strict about like this is the line you can never cross under any circumstances about attachments or about like, are we or are we not part of the military or things like that. That the attitude towards what constitutes the dark side is a little bit not looser, but a little bit broader. There's a scene in which there's a great group of Jedi who are kind of off on this planet as like the kind of the Old West Rangers, and they're all hanging out around a campfire, and this guy Porter is the chef, and you just absolutely love them. And then they find out about some people who are, have kidnapped a family, and they go after them. And at one point, Porter, his mount is shot out from under him, and he has to deal with the ambushers while everyone else is going ahead. And you hear it all in his voice, what's happening inside his head. And he decides, like, okay, they're the kind of cowards who ambush people and shoot an animal. The Force has told me that they have to die. Like, and he's very clear about, like, he has decided he's not going to try and take these people prisoners. He's going to kill them. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, so you're on the dark side now. And he's not necessarily. I think that there's I'm curious to see where his character goes, and if and I don't want to have spoilers, so if you know this, just kind of nod and smile at my ignorance. But like, it may well be that the idea is that he is starting to turn that direction, or it may well be that, yeah, Jedi try very hard to hold to the code, but people get angry and no one's perfect, and that's okay. And because he doesn't kill them in cold blood or anything like that. But there's a couple moments where he like could maybe try a little harder to capture them, but they die in combat. What's your take on all that?
I don't know. I guess I'm of like two minds on it. One, I didn't see it as much different from what we see in the prequel era with some of the Jedi, is that you do what you can, but at the end of it, like if they're not going to stop, or if they're not like,
right.
if there's no other way around it, then you do what you have to do. And it's not, I also don't think I viewed him so much as like relishing in it as just accepting that this was going to be the outcome. And that was maybe where they might differ a bit from the prequel era Jedi, in that there is that acceptance. There is that, have to do this, so I have to do it. And not so much like hand wringing over whether it's right or wrong. But yeah, so that was my understanding of it, is that it is like the dark side isn't just something that, like, it's not like I don't think he was tapping into it or anything. I think that he was making an educated decision based on his many years of knowledge, and just deciding and going with that and saying, okay, this is what has to happen. And maybe he is more prepared to do it than Bell, the other characters that are with him, Bell Zettifar and Loden Greatstorm, because of his experience and because of the things that he's been through. And maybe that is the difference, just that wisdom and that acceptance.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you about the lack of hand wringing. I think that's a better way to say kind of what I was trying to get at, that it seems like there's more understanding of that you can dip your foots into kind of some of those gray areas. I guess for me, what I got is, you're right. It's not that I think he's celebrating or he's like, ha, I'm going to kill these bad people. It's that his decision that the Force probably wants them to die isn't because of like the way they're shooting at me. The only way to stop them from shooting is to kill them. It's, I have seen the kind of tactics they use. I've seen the kind of people they are. They need to die. Which to me is the kind of thing where, like, when Anakin does something like that, Obi-Wan's like, no, Anakin, you can't do that. So yeah, it just felt different.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say about the Jedi, or should we move on to the Nihil?
As far as the Jedi go, one thing that is touched upon briefly, I think, in this book, but is expanded more throughout the rest of the series, is the idea that the Jedi had multiple outposts across the galaxy, and the Jedi would be stationed there. Not so much as like wardens or police or anything of that matter, but just so that their presence was throughout the galaxy, and that they were seeing what was going on in different corners of the galaxy. They were able to help people in those far reaches away from Coruscant, and they knew what was going on outside of the little bubble of the core. And you see that with like Bell and Loden. They're a temple or an outpost, a Jedi temple on Elfrana, I think is the planet. And I thought when I first read that, I thought that was so interesting because you see in like Rebels and Clone Wars these dilapidated temples, like on Lothal. You have the temple that is underground and is hidden, and you have all these other ones too, like in various other mediums of Star Wars. But you never really know. You always wonder, like, oh, wonder like who was there and what happened there. Like, why was this there? And so to see it in the High Republic explained as this just was what they used to do. Like they didn't just stay on Coruscant; they were everywhere, and it kind of makes more sense, I think, when you view it on that perspective, that they were everywhere in the galaxy, and then at some point they came away from that. How much that adds to Palpatine's plan to get the galaxy to forget about them. And to just be like, it was just like such a thing. Like they used to be everywhere and then they're not. So of course they become legends when they're no longer on this planet that they used to be on for hundreds of years, but suddenly no one sees them for another hundreds of years. Then they become a part of the local mythology. And I just thought that was a really great thing to do, is to like have them everywhere and then just take them away.
Yeah, I thought that was really powerful, especially because, like you said, they're everywhere, but it's not like they're the cop on the beat. Like most people will probably live their whole lives without ever experiencing one. And while there are some people who have a pretty good idea of what Jedi are, we also meet a lot of people who are just like, oh, so you're the space wizards. You're the like people who think like the Jedi can walk, can totally control everyone's mind, or, there's all sorts of fantastical stories and interesting moments of regular people being like, oh, so this is what a Jedi is like. Which I think also really has that. But part of the impression I got is that it's not necessarily that these outposts have been there for thousands of years, but that the Jedi are actively trying to expand them and to have it be that more, and that Palpatine's able to kind of cut that off before it gets to that full saturation level of, everyone's always going to remember them.
Yeah.
Because it was really interesting to me. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that the problem is that they were there for a while. And so they built themselves into like everyday locals. Like I think there was a point on some of these planets where everyday people did know that the Jedi were. They knew who the Jedi were. Yeah. They knew that they were real, and they were used to having them there, even if they never saw them. And and then due to events that happen, I mean, we get to see a little bit of this happen throughout the rest of the series in the High Republic of how it starts, but that carries on through to just before the prequel trilogy starts, is the shutting of these temples. And so when you have them, I think over these 250 years, slowly the outposts start shutting, until eventually there are like none left, or maybe like one or two. And you consider that the galaxy is this huge thing, huge expansive place with hundreds, thousands of planets. Then some of these planets and some of these sectors no longer have a presence of the Jedi at all. And even though some might, and some people still do know who the Jedi are, those don't. And so this presence that used to be every day and used to be very natural to everyone and accepted by everyone became a part of history, and history became legend, and legend became myth.
Yeah.
And and so like it's just interesting to see that happen. And 250 years isn't, in the grand scheme of things, a long time, but I think the fact, like the drasticness with which it happens, which is explored, I think, throughout the rest of the High Republic, is what makes it so interesting, and just how they were just able to cut it off.
I think it's really true. And I think about just like, what do I understand of just what times were like 50 or 100 years ago? Just, my grandmother, great-grandparents may have told the stories, you read things. But yeah, a lot of it's like, if your particular grandmother remembered one specific thing, that's what gets passed down. Yeah. And you sometimes get this idea of like, there are people who either they or someone else they knew, either in the recent or the far past, encountered a single Jedi who had a single power. And so they think all Jedi can do that, It's really interesting.
Like, the meme with the grandma and the granddaughter is walking her with her walker, and she's like, back in my day, this is like, sure, grandma, sure. That's how I picture it. Back in my day, there were Jedi walking the streets with us.
Oh yeah, I can totally see that. I like that. I also think they do a lot of interesting things about the Republic itself and what's happening with it. And
Mm.
I've enjoyed a lot of extended universe books, and I will continue to talk about them on here. And as you can tell, I'm working up to a but. But one thing that sometimes frustrates me about the extended universe, particularly its depictions of the past, and I have this with a lot of things like Game of Thrones and other things, there's very little signs of progress. There's often this idea of like, the Darth Bane books, which all take place 1,000 years before, everyone has all the same technology.
Mhm.
And, the Jedi have been like flying spaceships for 30,000 years. And here, it's definitely not that. Like, one thing we learn is that the part of why the Nihil are able to do what they do is that hyperspace is much more limited than it is by the time we get to the prequels and Solo and all the other things. And that our understanding of it, like as you mentioned, they've just discovered Bacta. If you remember, like the tank that Luke floats in when he's healing after his arms cut off, or that Boba Fett's in, that stuff is just being discovered now, 250 years before the main movies. And one of the big plot points, and I think this is again feeding into what you're talking about, is that the outer rim has mostly not been touched by the galaxy, by the Republic especially, and that this is all about a time of expanding into the High Republic. And see, when you think about this idea of the Republic is expanding, and we're getting a chance to communicate and trade and go between all these different worlds that you couldn't do before, at the same time that the Jedi are starting to pull back, that really helps to explain why there's all this kind of, big corporations take over, and there's all sorts of resentment towards the Jedi because, yeah, probably if you are hearing stories about the Jedi used to be everywhere, so why aren't they out here on Tatooine? Why aren't they out here dealing with slavery? Like, it's just one more part, I think, of the way this helps to subtly set up just how brilliant and awful Palpatine's plan was, and why the Outer Rim becomes what it is by the time of the prequels.
Yeah, and it's interesting because also what's explained in the High Republic is why they stop expanding into the Outer Rim.
Right.
So you have like Tatooine, and I'm pretty sure Lothal weren't a part of the Republic, and that's why you have like some of this miscommunication of like how they would never have found Anakin if it wasn't for them crash landing on Tatooine, because that's all, like Tatooine is Hutt space, and Hutt space, the Republic's relationship with the Hutts is explored in the High Republic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not even just the Jedi who were pulling back. It was the Jedi were pulling back, and the Republic was stagnant. It stopped expanding. And the big mission, which you get a sense of in Light of the Jedi, is that is the Republic's ultimate goal, is to continue expanding, like essentially ever expanding, and becoming this unified force. And that's why they're trying to get like Starlight Beacon, which is they have the opening of in this book, is meant to be this unifying symbol because it allows communications between the core and the outer rim, and that hadn't happened before. And so it was a way to show those planets in the outer rim, those sectors, that the Republic and the core care about them, and that they want them to be a part of everything. But when you have the emergences and you have the Nihil showing their faces, it's kind of like, well, we have to focus on this now. We can't focus on expanding anymore, because either we continue expanding and ignore the Nihil, or we don't have anything to expand at all. And so it's interesting to see just how this stopped, and like what would have happened if the Nihil hadn't become such a big issue. How far would the Republic have gone? And what's really interesting to me is that I think that highlights this the most, because we all know Ahsoka Tano. We all know that she's from, or most of us know that she's from a planet called Shili, the Togruta planet. And the Light of the Jedi.
Don't feel bad if you didn't know that. I'd forgotten. But go on.
Sorry. Light of the Jedi kind of explains that Shili isn't a part of the Republic yet. And Chancellor is trying very hard to kind of court Shilly and the Togrutas and bring them into the Republic because they have a lot of resources and a lot of things that could help, and so they're trying to make this like a mutually beneficial thing. And we know like eventually Shilly does become a part of the Republic, but the fact that they weren't yet, it's very interesting to me of how new that is by the time we get to the prequels, and maybe explains a bit why. This kind of goes deep into like kind of Ahsoka lore, is that like her people were viewed a force sensitive child who was sent to the Jedi as like a blessing, and that's why they called the Jedi to come get her, because it was a great honor for one of them to go to the Order and become a Jedi, and that kind of helps also explain that, because Shilly was still so new to the Republic. 250 years is nothing compared to how long Coruscant has been a part of the Republic, how long, some other planets. And so I think that these little ties, there are big ties to elsewhere in the franchise, but there are also these smaller ones that I really love seeing explored.
Yeah, like one other small little tie. There's a book that's about, I think it's just called Tarkin, and it's about, the origins of Grand Moff Tarkin. And I don't think it's in the top 10 of the books that I've read, but I think it's a fun book, and it tells you a lot about who he is. And it makes a big deal about the fact that he comes from this planet called, I think it's Ariadu, where they're a very strong, like, hunter-predator society. And that's not like really, and in the book, one of the things that the Nihil do, or at least one group of them, is try to basically go to a planet and say, hey, we know that emergencies are going to come soon. Pay us a lot of money and we'll stop it, or else we won't. Like, it's a blackmail thing. And they pay the money, and then the Nihil, because they screwed up, don't actually stop it. A moon is destroyed, and 1.5 billion people are killed. And the planet is like, we're going to swear revenge against you now. And it's Ariadu. And it's just, if you'd read the Tarkin book, if you know about that, that's where Tarkin's from, and they wind up showing up at the final battle and are like, yeah, Republic, we will help however you want. We will sacrifice whatever you want. Let us be the one to capture them. And it's chilling, and it gives you so much background on Tarkin. So yeah, I love those little connections. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say about the Republic and all this is that, and I love what you said about, because, let me start that again. The other thing I think is so important, building off on what you were saying about the Republic and this idea of the Chancellor, So, I think is her name.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Chancellor So. Like I said, her slogan is, we are all the Republic, because normally if you tell a story about a central government that wants to expand its control out into the outer reaches, that sounds like colonialism. That sounds like exploitation. That sounds like the people in the center are going to look down on the people out in the rim. And her whole We Are the Republic thing is really, she's not trying to say to the Gruta, you have to be part of the Republic. She's courting them. And she's really trying to teach everyone to be equals, that we are all, like, that they are the Republic, we are the Republic. And now, because if you, and contrast that to what we eventually learned did happen. And this is a little bit mentioned in the prequel movies, but especially in the Clone Wars TV show and somewhat in the book, that a lot of the Separatists are people from the Outer Rim who did feel like they were always second-class citizens, and that they were, you kind of very much like in our own global economy now, that places like Coruscant and other places like that, and Corellia, we're just seeing those outer worlds as resources for, go there and strip mine the place and bring all the resources back for our economy, exactly as works in, our own world. And so there's something kind of very beautiful, but also a little bit tragic, because we know that this idea would have made everything so much better, and we know that it doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's like, and I think that just plays in so much to like how well both the team of authors behind the High Republic as a whole, but also Charles Soule with this book, really sets the scene for giving us these grand ideas that these people have and the ways to make the Republic better. And you read it and you're like, oh my God, this sounds amazing, but what happens. And so it's set up from the beginning to be a tragic story. And that this thing isn't gonna be there by the time we get to the prequels. This idea is no longer gonna exist by the time we get there. So what happens to make it that way? And
Yeah.
that's really their pool of it, is like playing on the things that we know and the things that we don't know, and how it gets from point A to point B. And I love so much about that. I feel like it was the strategy behind this was done
Yeah.
really well.
Yeah, and I'll say I think a lot of the extended universe books really connect well to each other. Some of them are pretty divergent though, and seem like they're written by people who haven't been talking to each other. Clearly, someone was making sure that all the High Republic authors were on the same page and we're all talking to each other, because it the whole thing has a real cohesion to it that you haven't seen. And that's really hard to be clear. That's not a shot at the EU. That's really hard to achieve across a number of different authors.
Well, they took it very seriously. So when this first, I think, Light of the Jedi came out in 2020, and the announcement was made in 2019, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
For that whole like early 2019, 2018, maybe even into 2017, 2016, they had been building up this idea of what to do, and they called it like this Project Luminous. And the authors, the 4 or 5 authors from phase 1 of the High Republic, the first set of books we get, were like Team Luminous, and they spent like at least a week, if not more, at Lucasfilm headquarters in San Francisco, planning all of this out. And that's when they decided who was going to write which book. And they had all of the main points of like what was going to happen, the timeline and everything really planned out. And even though each author got a bit of freedom in their own books to decide, some of the smaller details and everything, they had the major points planned out, and they knew what was going to happen here, and they shared with each other. And if someone was going to, so if someone was going to be writing a book that relied heavily on what was happening in this book, then those 2 authors shared what they had, and they could build off of that. Or if someone was going to be writing a character that another author had first written, then they would come together and decide how to write, if it was making sense, if the characterization was making sense. And so it's incredibly cohesive and just really, really well done. And like you said, it's not easy to do that. Yeah. When you have a lot of minds together, you're inevitably going to have like some big differences on some points, but you can't really tell. Maybe occasionally you can tell that, someone has a different perspective of the character than one of the other authors do. But really not any glaringly obvious differences. And I love that. It just really shows how much they also care about this thing that they've created and this idea that they've brought to Star Wars.
It's really true. And I think this is a time where the Disney connection and also what had happened with the movies becomes very important, because part of what they're doing is very much what Feige was doing earlier on in the MCU and still attempting to do with a lot of the MCU, to less success, I think, than at earlier times. But still, there is an awful lot of cohesion in those stories. And I think those lessons were definitely passed on. And like, without getting into arguing which vision of Star Wars you like better, I don't think there's anybody who wouldn't agree that Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams had very different visions, and that's part of what raises a lot of the questions people have about the sequels and which ones you like and don't, is that they clearly didn't go through this kind of process. And this is happening a year after that. And so it makes me kind of wonder, like, I think there were all sorts of good reasons to do it. I also think they got a lot of criticism of it not happening with a series of movies. And, but either way, I think it is incredibly effective, and I'm really glad it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very thankful for it. I'm also thankful that they have like a set timeline for it. Like they have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and we're currently in phase 3 as far as books being published right now. Yeah. And even though they can go, I wouldn't be surprised if they go back and fill in some gaps, especially for phase 2. They're focusing on this timeline, this completed phase 1, we completed phase 2, the main story points, I guess, of these phases before they go back and fill in anything else. And I think that that's really important, because it keeps it progressing. Yeah. And there's an end in sight. Yeah. And so there is an end to this thing we call the High Republic, like this book series we call the High Republic. It doesn't mean that it won't be filled in a little bit more, but there is an end point to it. And I think that that's really important in creating a successful series, especially a book series with multiple authors behind it.
Definitely. Let's talk about the Nihil some. What did you think of them as sort of the main antagonists we're getting introduced to?
God, I love them. I think they're some of the best antagonists in Star Wars. Markian Ro, I think, which if you don't know, there's a big debate of whether his name is pronounced Markian or Martian, and the authors don't even agree.
And most importantly, the readers of the books on tape don't agree.
Yeah, so it'll be pronounced differently, and I think I'm convinced it's just become a big joke now. They realized it like within the first couple of books that were released, and then they just decided to play with it and not tell anyone what the exact right pronunciation of it is. So I used to be a Martian person, and then for some reason switched to Markian. So I'm sticking with Markian now, but I think that he is a really, really excellent villain. Or maybe not villain, I guess, like you said, antagonist. He's a really, really excellent antagonist. And I love how in this book, and I think it's fair to say in the rest of phase 1, how ominous he is.
Yeah.
And you learn things about him in like in waves, I guess. And it all adds up to finally getting the whole of him, I think, in like phase 3. And I just love the suspension and anticipation that he and the other Nihil bring, because you literally, like, I have no idea what or who they are, where they come from. And all of that information has to be earned. And I think that is such a rare thing in Star Wars, to have an antagonist truly be something that you have to earn that information about them. There's not anything in your lore, in your expanded universe, really, that is going to help you understand what this is, except for the information you get through these books. And I love when that happens in this, because it really feels fresh and it feels scary. He's the only Star Wars antagonist I think that I actually was like in phase 1 scared of. And just because he's so unknown, and they played on that element really, really well.
They really do. And they, especially because they mostly let you see him through the eyes of the other people in the Nihil, who start out like seeing him as kind of a pushover. And then by the end are like, yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Please don't kill me, sir. Because I kind of feel like that when that reveal happened, we've seen some of his stuff. Like he's not a nice guy. He has this like old woman from the Santeca family, which we'll talk about in a different episode, and she has like some kind of connection that allows her to find the paths, and he flat out tortures her to get these out of her. But even then, he feels kind of like meek and like he's doing this, and so when there's that reveal and he's like, oh yeah, no, I intentionally set off a third of you to die, and you, Lorna, I intentionally set you up to fail so that all your people would see that you could fail, so they would see that they follow you, but that I'm better. Like, I felt myself kind of sympathetic for all these horrible people who he's tossing around, because they were terrified, and you're right, I was terrified of him too. And that's just such an effective thing to do.
Yeah, I love it. And there's obviously I won't give any spoilers for this, but in phase 1 there's a 2-issue comic also written by Charles Soule, called The Eye of Darkness, I think. Is that what it's called? Eye of the Storm. Sorry, The Eye of the Storm. And it's one of the best. Like, you think like 2-issue comic can't be that much in it. It is absolutely wonderful. If you can, I highly recommend reading it. It's set up, it's framed like a play. And I think that it's just such a wonderful mixture of the framing of a play, but how do you use print visuals to give you the same feeling as a live visual gives you, if that makes sense. And I really don't think that Charles Soule gets enough credit for how amazing that comic is. So I know not everyone can read comics, but if you can, I highly recommend getting and reading those. Very, very good.
Yeah, definitely. The last thing I want to say about them, and I'm curious your thoughts on it, because I'm still wrestling with it. And I think I heard this. I read the book a couple of years ago, but this time I listened to it on audio. And I still say books on tape, which makes everyone laugh at me as an old man. But the last Nihil scene during the epilogue is him kind of revving them all up, and he gives them his whole speech of like, we should have our freedom, and no one, the Jedi and the Republic, want to infringe on our freedom. And it's like their freedom to go kill other people and steal from them. Which I have some thoughts about robber barons and the Territarians, but we'll get off of that. And he ends it with saying, "We are the Nihil." And then in the next scene, the Chancellor ends by saying, "We are all the Republic." There's a clear parallel there. What do you think was trying to be conveyed in that?
I think it's Markian trying to mimic a leader.
Yeah.
And I mean, this could be biased. Like we're halfway through almost phase 3 now, so I have a little bit more perspective of him as a character. But even with that, it does seem like you're kind of questioning in this book, like, what does he want? What is his end goal with this? Is it freedom? Is it power? Is it like, what is it? Does he even know what his end goal is with this? And so to have those two things so similar, and him like never have said like, "We are the Nihil" before, it does kind of feel like a mimicry of it. And maybe it's meant to be a mimic, maybe because he himself doesn't really know how to lead, or and it can be this at the same time, a mockery of what the Republic is, an intentional mockery of what the Republic's trying to be, and saying like they want to be this, but we can be this, like we can do that too. And also I think probably just like a desperate need to make the Nihil more unified than they are, because if you don't have some sort of, and if that message is just freedom to do whatever you want to do, no matter how horrible it is, and then that is going to keep it from fracturing even more. And I think one of the things we realize in this book is that it was kind of at risk of that. And you have so many personalities who, like, in order to have, all this destruction wrought in your name, you're going to have these big, powerful personalities who hate each other. How do you keep them together?
Having a bunch of people who are all fighting like hell for freedom in a rigid authoritarian group does not work.
Yeah. And they will kill each other if given the chance. So how do you keep them from killing each other? How do you keep them, or how do you lessen it?
Right.
Then, because I mean, he's not going to prevent them from doing that, but how do you lessen it? How do you keep them going towards the main goal that they think is for all of them, but is probably actually just for you? So I can see like the need to do that, and basing it somewhat off of the Republic as well.
Yeah. No, I think it's really true. And I have to say, I read this book with some trepidation when it first came out, because part of what I liked was the idea that there weren't going to be the Sith around, and that there wasn't going to be this dark side using group. And so when I first started reading about how they have this kind of power to understand hyperspace that no one else does, I got a little like, is this just going to be the Diet Sith? But they make it really clear that Marchion does not understand the Force and does not connect to it. I think that there's supposed to be some idea that the Santekas do, and that the kind of old woman who he has, particularly because, and this is again going to like, it's not just the High Republic, all of these books are in conversation with each other in some way. We're getting these books about Thrawn, where we're learning that their version of Force power among the Chiss does allow people to navigate through hyperspace. And so, and again, if you've read more, again, you can just smile at my ignorance, but I think we're supposed to think that the Santekas are in some way Force sensitive, and that has something to do with this ability, but Marchion clearly doesn't understand that. And like, he picks up a lightsaber and it kills someone with it, but he clearly has, like, he knows the Jedi are powerful. And in, again, one of the darkest parts of the book, he understands that the best way to break a Jedi is not with chains or with torture, but to surround him with misery. Which is just, we'll talk more about that as the book goes on, later books, because that's such a good understanding of the dark side, I think, in so many ways. But yeah, I just love that he's not Sith, that he's not there. And also there isn't this, like, I'm sure the Acolyte, we're going to learn how the Sith that do exist at this point are overlapping with the Nihil a little bit, and maybe they are whispering to them, but they're not. This isn't just the Sith by a different name, which I really liked. Yeah,
it's new. Like I said, you can't pull on any knowledge or lore that you might have to understand him in this first book. It is purely just learning as you go, which again is so rare in Star Wars. I always appreciate it when it happens.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's really true. Last thing that I want to ask you about, well, actually, and one of the things I think that is so helpful on it is basically like, sending Yoda out for coffee for the whole series. He does show up later in some ways, but I think especially for this first book, just saying he's off on sabbatical is so helpful, because again, I think like you want to latch on to what you know, and Yoda's the only character who's alive at this point, as far as we know, that we do know. So I think taking him off the board makes it also open.
Yeah, it absolutely does. It like you said, it prevents you from holding on to the known, and you
Yeah.
just fully have to embrace the unknown and start from scratch, essentially.
Yeah. I said something earlier about how we were going to talk a little bit more about Elzar and Avar in the bonus section, but of course I forgot this entire episode is the bonus section. So I'll just ask you as our last question. We now know who's cast, that Avar Chris and Elzar Mann are going to be a part of the Acolyte. And Carrie Ann Moss, the actress from The Matrix and from Jessica Jones, is going to be playing Avar Chris.
Wait,
or am I wrong? No, am I wrong?
No.
Okay.
The only character from the High Republic books who's going to be in the Acolyte, at least for the first season, is Vernestra Rowe.
Oh, okay. I thought it was Avar. Okay. Never mind. To quote the
I was like, wait, what? No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, let's then just end actually by talk a little bit more about the Way Seekers. And what do you understand that to be?
I understand it to be a Jedi who doesn't feel like their call through the Force is to be with the Order all the time.
Yeah.
And that they are kind of, I think I kind of view it as them giving themselves fully to the Force, essentially, and going where it calls them to go. And they don't have any restrictions on that from the Order. They don't have to ask permission. They don't have to, make time out to go and follow that calling. That is just what they do. And it takes them where it takes them. They uncover things as they go. They can come back to the temple whenever they want. They are a part of the Order still, but they aren't at its beck and call, essentially. They're at the Force's beck and call. And that's what I understand it to be. And that's why I really believe that Ahsoka would have been the perfect fit for a Way Seeker. If, like, in a perfect world, like, especially after her after she was kicked out of the Order, essentially, and invited back, if she had come back and we had this, suddenly they did have Way Seekers again, and that is what I think she would do. And I think it is essentially what she does after Order 66.
I think so, yeah.
She gives herself over to the Force as much as she can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would definitely agree with that. And I think I would even go further that I think this may have caused more problems than it may be, but I think Anakin might have explored being a Way Seeker. I think even, like, there are some versions of Dooku where he starts to have real problems with the ideas of the Jedi before he turns to the dark side, and that he might have become a Way Seeker. That it's partly that when the Jedi became much more rigid of it's our way or the highway. Like, one thing I think about is that by the prequels, they're very, very proud of the fact that so few people have ever left the Jedi. And, that's part of why they just can't conceive that Dooku would do it. And I remember thinking that when I reread that recently after having read some of the High Republic books, I was like, yeah, but, like, how many of those people, like, who were Way Seek, like, to what extent are you saying no one ever left? Because you made it really hard to leave, because you could basically leave in everything but name,
Yeah.
And, like, does the way, are there a lot of these folks who, like, had basically left the Order but were Way Seekers, and so now you're making it harder for those people to do anything but turn to the dark side, and B, you've cut yourself to understanding that, like, in the past, not everyone was a dyed-in-the-wool, follow the rules down the line, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mace Windu style Jedi. I'm going to take Mace Windu actually out of that, because that will,
Yeah. Sorry, my internet is connected.
No problem. I think we'll just call it here then. Danielle, thank you so much. I'm going to post all the links to find Danielle and all of her stuff. The internet has decided that I have started critiquing Mace Windu again, and that is not to be allowed, so we're going to just have to end it here. But members, thank you so much. This is wonderful. Well, you're back a little bit now, so I'll just say, like, do you have any other last... Forget the Mace Windu of it all, but do you have any last things to say about kind of that whole idea of the... how different it was,
Yeah, no, I definitely agree everything you said about maybe Jedi wouldn't have left completely if they had that freedom to go and explore themselves and their connection to the Force away from the Order and away from the Council, and kind of heal that connection. I think that's what it did for a lot of Wayseekers. And it wasn't like you chose to be a Wayseeker and you could never come back and not be a Wayseeker. You could.
Right.
And so I think that.
Okay, well, sadly, we've lost Danielle entirely. This was an act of hubris. Thank you, everyone. You're wonderful as members of this podcast. You make this all possible. Have a good night.